Stylus wept.
Hello everyone. So I've been playing a lot of R.E.P.O lately, which if you haven't heard of it yet, is a game where you play as these little robots who go into haunted or abandoned locations and try to collect as many valuables as possible and get back out before the monsters can get them. It's a fairly simple game, but the developers really knew what they were doing, and I've been having a lot of fun with it so far. One of the main things that I like about the game is the monster design, so I figured it'd be a great idea to do a series of drawing videos focused around the monsters. So that's what we're going to do today. And the monster that I've selected is the clown. This is one of the first monsters that I ran into, so when I had this idea, he was at the top of my list. Now first off, this guy has a crazy design. There's a lot going on visually. He's got these big puffy eyelids, but the eye sockets themselves seem to be empty. And his posture is so crazy that it took multiple run-ins with him to figure out what was actually going on with his body. And I can't tell if he always has his right arm wrapped around his leg like that, but in the reference image that I found and in a couple different captures that I caught, he has one arm looped under his calf and around his shin. And then of course there's the anglerfish nose that's all stretched out with the nostrils running up towards the giant stereotypical red clown nose at the end, which, spoiler alert here, he shoots a giant laser beam out of. And you put all that together, and he's like E.T. and one of the killer clowns from outer space came down and had a baby together. A giant angry baby that really hates robots being in his house. Then again, with that giggle he does, maybe he's actually happy to see us, who knows. Anyways, back to the drawing. Right now I'm getting all my basic details sketched out, and I'm remaining pretty loyal to the reference photo that I picked. The final line work step, which is what I'm starting right now, I'll go through and add more details as I refine those lines. This is probably my favorite step of the drawing process. For a long time before I started doing digital work, I worked only in pencil and ink on paper. So black and white, thin, precise line work with a lot of cross-hatching and little details is really my bread and butter. And I love doing creepy, grotesque monsters where I can go over the top with little gross details. Now you may notice with this one, I didn't do any cross-hatching, and that's because I knew that I would be doing color. That's not to say you can't do cross-hatching and color in the same image. I just prefer to do my shading in the color step if I'm going to be coloring it. That's really just down to artist preference. I've seen a lot of artists that do some really good cross-hatching and color mix, and I even do it from time to time, but it's mostly just a time-saving thing. Back to the clown though. Another detail that I didn't notice until starting this drawing was that he was wearing that little floppy hat on top of his head and those tattered blue pants, which on one hand kind of leans into like a old-fashioned hobo clown kind of look, but it also gives him kind of a fishing vibe, which I think is funny because it ties in with his anglerfish nose. Now that I've got the majority of my clean lines done, I'm going back through and adding more detail. I tend to do that with each step of the drawing process. So I'll get general details in the sketch, and then I'll add a little bit more with the line work, and then once I'm done with the main line work, I'll go through and add more detail with finer lines, and then I'll go back in on the final color step, and I'll even add more details and textures as I'm coloring. And if you've seen any of my previous drawing videos, you know what I'm doing right now is I'm blocking out my shape so that I can fill it with a neutral background color and then select that color so that I don't have to worry about skipping outside of the lines while I'm coloring, and it just speeds up the process altogether. And you'll notice that I'm kind of doing the detail for each color area as I'm doing that specific area before I move on to the next item. And that's something that I've started doing more recently as I've begun using bigger files for the drawing. Because with the program that I use, Procreate, the bigger the file, the fewer available layers you have. So instead of doing all of my flat colors and then going back through and adding my details and my shading and my textures, I'm doing each individual color area and then adding the shading for that area and the detail and compressing that down and then merging that into the main color layer with the rest of them and moving on to the next item, which can kind of be a pain in the butt, but I've gotten used to it at this point and it's worth the extra detail that you can get at a bigger file size. I've been thinking about looking into different software to use on PC instead of iPad like I've been doing for the past couple years, and my video editing software is on my PC. I'm sure that the softwares that are available on PC are probably better, but I'm so used to Procreate and it's so simple and intuitive that I feel like it'd be more difficult for me to switch at this point. Alright, so now I'm working on the teeth, and in the original character design, he's only got like 10 of them, and they're pretty slender, and there's not much texture to them, which isn't a problem for the design because the game's pretty dark, but I figured for my version, I would lean into making them look really gross and dirty looking. And now moving on to the flesh tone inside of the nostrils and those slices on his eyes. Added that extra bit of flesh into the nostrils to add depth and make it look like we could look into his head. And then once we're done with that, we're going to move on up to his hat, which is fairly simple, nothing to write home about. We're just going to do tan with a brown band and then use a mix of dark brown and really light tan to give it that straw hat texture. And then I'm just going to lower the opacity so that the shading isn't too harsh. And now that that's done, we can move on to the skin tone. And I just filled in the remaining space with our base skin tone, and then I'm adding the shading. And once I'm done with the shading, I'm going to lower the opacity and then go in and add the blue tone to his eyelids so that I can put it under the shading. Because there's no point going through and shading all of his skin and then adding the blue over top of that and then shading the blue separately when I can just do it all in one. And just like with the hat, I'm shading with black, and then once I'm done with my shading, I'm going to lower the opacity so that it becomes just a dark skin tone. And once that's done for his eye makeup, I'm going to use a spray paint brush so that the edges are soft but not too smooth like they would be if I was using an airbrush, because I want the eye makeup to look partially like makeup, but also kind of like a natural skin pigment that he has in that area. And I think the rough, blotchy edges can help with that. And then for the lighting on his skin, I'm actually using an airbrush because I want those areas to seem more soft and smooth, kind of give his skin that creepy softness, because I'm imagining his skin would probably be pretty squishy to the touch. And now onto his giant pulsating laser ball nose, and I also used a spray paint brush to blend the skin tone into the red for the nose. And then I'm going to add a real bright tone to the middle because it's kind of glowing from the inside. And then I'm going to use my light brush to add kind of a shine to the veins so that it looks a little bit wet from the outside. And then for the last step, I'm just going to go through and add some lighting effects to the nose, have some of that light playing across him, and then after I get all my lighting done, I'm going to make a copy of the color layer and open a hue and saturation filter and drop the brightness all the way down on it, and then erase bits out of that to kind of create a more dynamic lighting, which is another quick, easy trick that I figured out over the years to kind of speed up the drawing process. Alright, and with that he's done. Here's the final image, the clown from R.E.P.O. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, I'd appreciate a like, and if you could hit that subscribe button. And as always, feel free to drop by the comment section if you have a suggestion for a future video or even just to say hi. Thanks again. Have a good one.
Jesus wept.